Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you for waiting, everyone. I'm so sorry about that delay. Our second webinar in a row we've had just a little bit of technical issues with again, but that's okay. We'll get going now anyway. And any latecomers can just join in whenever they get here. Okay. So welcome everyone to our November webinar, like nowhere else on Earth, rare plants and communities on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge. My name is Katie Grayson and I will be your host on behalf of the Wildflower Society of Western Australia. Today's webinar will be presented and recorded on Noongar country, and the Society pays our respect and acknowledges the traditional custodians of this land where we are hosting, the Whadjuk and the Menang people. We also acknowledge and recognise the traditional custodians of the different lands where everyone is joining us from. I would also like to just thank everyone for reserving tickets and joining us tonight, and especially putting up with a few technical issues. It's really great to see so much interest in these fields, and we really appreciate the support from all of you as well. So the presentation will go for around 45 minutes, where we will, of course, conclude with some Q&A. Feel free to send your questions through as the presentation goes, and we will respond to them at the end. During the Q&A, if you do feel like you'd like to ask your question aloud, then please feel free. You can just raise your hand in the toolbar and we can unmute your mic when we get around to you. So hopefully we don't run into any more technical issues tonight, but if any do come up, especially for our attendees, please just contact the email address on the events website, or you can just reply to any of the emails that you would have received about this event tonight. So we are very lucky to be joined by this month's guest speaker, Professor Stephen Hopper, AC. Steve is a Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Western Australia and has been since 2012, which was the same year Steve was awarded Australia's highest civilian honour, Companion of the Order of Australia, and inducted into the Western Australian Science Hall of Fame. Steve has an extraordinary 50 years as a conservation biologist and teacher, including 12 years leading Kings Park and Botanic Garden and 6 years leading the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. Steve is a well-published scientific author whose research focuses on sustainable living with biodiversity, especially with Aboriginal Elders and old climatically buffered infertile landscapes such as granite outcrops. Of course, I can only begin to briefly summarise Steve's work and achievements, but in today's webinar, Professor Hopper will summarise close to 60 years of visiting the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge, focusing on rare plant surveys conducted in the 1980s, where considerable flora components were undescribed. For example, the presently known 50 species of the orchid genus Caladenia. Professor Hopper and colleagues named about half of these, now known in the Augusta Margaret River Shire. Local endemic species are a feature of the ridge, as well as rare hybrids and rare communities, including those of inland granite outcrops, each with their own mix of rock outcrop and Nama rock pool species. Professor Hopper also discusses the ongoing discoveries of new weeds and a completely fresh perspective on emerging flora from walking together with Wadandi people, the Webb family in particular. So I will let Steve take over and begin their presentation. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Katie, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me try and move to the next slide. No, it's not moving for me. How about that? Can you move it, Katie, by any chance?
Let me just have a quick look. Should be able to.
I have to approve you. There we go. The challenges of remote communication, eh? Is it frozen?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be letting me move it either.
There we go. Now you're on the third slide there. Go back.
Oh, does it keep going? Sorry, I think there's a little bit of a lag tonight.
How's that? I know that's gone right back to the start, I presume. Oh, there we go. That's the second slide, right?
Okay, there we go. It's caught up for me as well.
Caught up. All right, so I have to wait a while. Okay, so first of all, let me convey my appreciation of the Wadandi people and in particular the Webb family. This shows one of the most remarkable plants that is in the Augusta Margaret River area. They know it as Baru, and Dasypogon hookeri, or pineapple bush is a species. And to me, this looks like something from South America, completely out of place. And it's in a lineage of plants that is placed in its own order, Dasypogonales. This is one level above families. And that order, with one exception, is entirely endemic to southwestern Australia. So there's this remarkable ancient flora and lots of other things about Wadandi culture. Some of their names are on street signs now. This is a development at Witchcliff, so Coolbardy Way, you might see in the middle of the slide for magpies, Marnich Place for the black cockatoo. And interestingly, up in the top right is Wardagga Rock, which is a long way from Wadandi country. It's up near Mount Singleton, but it's a Wadandi word as far as we know. It means a man of very high degree. So the influence of the Wadandi people extends well beyond their geographical distribution. Does the next slide come up? Yes, hopefully. I can see it. So I have been fortunate enough to visit the Augusta Margaret River area since the mid-1960s. My family moved from Eastern Australia. I was born just near Byron Bay, and when I was 14, we moved west, and I stayed in WA, and the family moved on to other places. But when we first arrived, a great aunt of mine, my mother's aunt, lived at Caladenia, in that grand metropolis of 2 houses it was in those days. I think it might be 3 houses now. And our Auntie Lyle had the house on the west side of the crossroads at Caladenia. So this was my first visit to the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge, and subsequently there's been many. My wife and I, Chris, had our honeymoon in the little annex of the Caladenia house that Lyle Disher owned. So I have a special affection for the ridge and a family connection in that regard. The ridge is what I call Caladenia Central. It really is and was an extraordinary place. When I was appointed in 1978 as the state's first Flora Conservation Research Officer in the then Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. And my job was to go and survey the flora from one end to the other and document where rare plants were, help create new nature reserves and national parks. And when we hit the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge in the 1980s, some 25 species were then known to occur on the ridge, so pretty rich. But as we explored the country up and down the ridge, it became clear that in fact double that number of species existed. And Andrew Brown and I collaborated for many years in surveying these things, particularly in the 1980s, and ended up publishing the special issue of Noitsia, shown in the bottom right here, called Spider Fairy and Dragon Orchids of Western Australia, in which 25 new members of the genus Caladenia were described. So it's an incredibly important place for this genus, the richest place we know of across Australia. And there are many endemics. So this slide shows you just three or four of the endemics. Caladenia citrina in the top left, the Margaret River spider orchid as it's now known, and the inset map is from Flora base, so the blue dots with the white bullseye locations of herbarium specimens for this species. And you can see the Margaret River spider orchid clusters around Margaret River with one representative population up the Yellingham, for example. To the right of that is Caladenia nivalis, the exotic spider orchid. And that too is a northern Leeuwin naturalist endemic. Down the bottom is a southern, two southern ones. So Caladenia logiana is known from Augusta. And the dot that's centered on Margaret River is in fact inaccurate. It alludes to a very inaccurate location recorded for that species. So Logiana is literally an Augusta endemic. And to the right of that is Caladenia falcordia, subspecies augustensis, again another Augusta endemic. And in the middle is Caladenia excelsa. So I think the next slide, no, it doesn't show. I'll go back. So just wanted to point out in this, the inset map shows, again, excelsa is a northern Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge endemic, but you'll see there's one dot in the coastal plain to the east of Augusta. That's, again, an inaccurate herbarium specimen location. So can't believe everything you see on Flora base. The algorithm they run to create the distribution maps relies on the accuracy of the specimen data recorded. But by and large, you get the drift. There are many endemics. And people have a passion for these critters, orchids. They really do seem to get you in once you start searching for them. And I just wanted to put up this slide about fencing for orchid conservation. My wife's sister, Robin Collins, and her husband, Ken, have had a bush block until relatively recently to the east of Witchcliffe. And they noticed, among other species, the Margaret River spider orchid was on their property, but also they had many kangaroos. And they erected fencing wire and rabbit-proof fencing down the bottom of the fence line to protect the orchids. They have about half a dozen such small areas, about each one about half a hectare or so, and they've worked very effectively in caring for the orchids and allowing them to flower without being munched upon. Among the finds was Caladenia excelsa, previously mentioned, and it's was until very recently regarded as the largest of all the spider orchids in the genus. You can see tremendously long, dangly sepals and petals on it, and this thing gets up to 90 centimetres tall. So it's a photo of our daughter Claire when she was 3, standing beside one. You can see the spider orchid almost reaches to the top of her head. And this slide showing an enlargement of the Flora base map just highlights the 2 dubious locations, in fact, for the species. So the Scott River one I've already talked about, pardon me, and there's another location which just says Margaret River area. So the algorithm has therefore plonked a blue marker on Margaret River town, but we know that as far as we know, the species doesn't actually occur in the town itself. It's more towards the coast to the west and going up north. Furthermore, just this year, the tallest spider orchid now recorded was discovered by Dr. Christine Marsack, just north of Margaret River. And it's this species, Caladenia infundibularis, which is named by the botanist Alex George in the 1980s. And if you look at the central photo there, you can see that at top flower is sitting at about 110 centimetres. So this thing gets, in fact, up 1.11 metres tall photo on the left shows you the whole plant. Before the discovery of this individual, the species was only known to attain about 40 centimetres. So it just highlights there are riches still to be found, and so much more for us to learn about the spider orchids on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge. You'll also find this plant, which I've called the rarest of all hybrids among those, at least in WA. This has got 4 dots on the Flora base map, one just north of Margaret River. But the first specimen of this very rare hybrid was collected by the Victorian botanist A.C. Buglehole in 1965. You can see a couple of individuals have been found, one near Mount Barker, one just to the east of Albany, and it's a hybrid between 2 genera. So the silky orchid, Cyanicula sericea, the blue flowered parental species shown there, and the pink enamel orchid. When you cross the 2 of these, you get this hybrid, and Andrew Brown and I named it in 2001 as cross Cyanthera glossodioides. So the Cyanthera is a combination of the generic names of the 2 parents, and glossodioides alludes to the genus Glossodia, which is an Eastern States genus, and it alludes to the structure of the calli on this very rare hybrid. So rare plants can be rare because of local geographical distribution. They can be rare because they are, like in this example, extremely rare hybrids. One plant we discovered in the 1980s is right on the tip of Cape Naturaliste. Let me get it right. It's not actually out in the ocean, as the map indicates. So then there's another example of an inexact description on the herbarium specimen of the location. All the 4 dots there should be on the one position. And this was a completely new species of wormbia that we turned up in 1987 when we were doing the walks associated with the lighthouse. Showed it to Terry McFarlane, who was working on the genus. He was in the WA Herbarium at the time and still is. And he initially thought it was another named species of wormbia, but had a more careful look over the ensuing couple of years and decided that no, this was a point endemic in the genus wormbia. It's declared as rare, so it's extremely rare beast. And in this slide, I show on the left my field notes from that day, 19th of June 1987, with a rough field sketch and a tiny inflorescence down the bottom, stuck into the field book, and my description of the new species. So we twigged that it was something different. I'd never seen anything like it. And the photo shows you the precise location. Now, normally I wouldn't do this, particularly for a point location beast, but I show you this because this is a photo taken earlier this year, and we were right on the spot and couldn't find any evidence of the species there. So has it persisted through underground bulbs, which it has, and hardly came up at this time in the year, 19th of June. Maybe it needs a bit longer for the leaves to show up and then the flowers. It's one that occasionally has been monitored by DBCA, but it's very clearly something that we need to keep a close watch on. It's off the walk trail, but not far off the walk trail, running along this beautiful stretch of the coastline. So that's an example of a point endemic. Nowhere else, found nowhere else on Earth, and only discovered in 1987 and named 2 years later. Another point endemic that has attracted a lot of attention is this mallee, which was named in 1992 by Laurie Johnson, the late director of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and Ken Hill, a colleague of his, collaborating with him on looking at eucalypt taxonomy. The map is again a classic example showing you the range of variation you get in the latitudes and longitudes from early days in particular, given on herbarium sheets. So all those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 blue dots should be on the same point above Meelup Beach. So this eucalypt was first collected in 1981 by R. Kerr Lewis, and it was intriguing because it had very rough bark at the base, as you can see in the photo, and buds and fruits that looked a little bit like Eucalyptus decipiens. Furthermore, it was in just one place, completely surrounding a small car park. Car park itself was about 30 metres long by 15 metres across, and all around the edge of it was this eucalypt. What it was, it caused a lot of debate and argument because it was only known from this single place. Two hypotheses that could explain it were an extremely rare species that was reduced down to this tiny population. So were all the plants around the car park the same individual, or were they multiple individuals, was the key question. And in 1981, we certainly didn't have the DNA techniques we do have these days. So a paper came out in 2021, authored by Donna Bradbury, Rachel Binks and Margaret Byrne, all from DBCA, called Genomic Data Informed Conservation of Rare Tree Species, Clonality, Diversity and Hybridity in Eucalyptus Series in a Global Biodiversity Hotspot. So that's a long-winded way to say it was an investigation in particular focused on what was Eucalyptus phylaceus. What was it, a rare species, or was it in fact an extremely rare hybrid? And the potential, if it was a hybrid, the potential species who were parents include decipiens. So decipiens is shown in the map as light grey. So you can see it occurs right up the coastal plain north of Perth and down into the southern Jarrah forest, abutting the Garry forest. An alternative was Eucalyptus lanepulii, known from Badgingarraway and Keysbrook and the like on the Darling Scarp, south of Perth. And another alternative that didn't occur to anyone, including myself or Ian Brooker, it was Eucalyptus virginia. Virginia is a species we named in 2004, endemic to Mount Lindsay. It was at that stage, and a white bark tree up to 20 metres tall and a metre in trunk diameter, the last of the big forest trees, as far as we know, to be named. So this study by Bradbury et al. Involved applying modern DNA techniques, SNPs they're called, in which 3,875 characters emerged from looking at samples of 51 individuals that included all the potential parent species plus the single meal-up location of Eucalyptus phylaceus. The top scatter bivariate plots indicate the outcome of that analysis. Now, if it's a very rare hybrid, you would expect it to be along the alignment between its putative parents. And you can see on the left-hand bivariate plot, a lot of the variation in those 3,875 characters. So it's on the x-axis, 30%, 29.6, and on the y-axis, 19%. So this is half the variation is summarised in that bivariate plot. Now on the bottom, you can see that Eucalyptus lanepulii and Eucalyptus relicta. Sorry, I didn't mention relicta, but that's another species that Grant Wardle Johnson and I named when we named Virginia. I might have said Ian Brooker and I named it, but it was Grant Wardle Johnson and I. My apologies, Grant. You can see Lane Poolii and relicta clustering together in the middle, low on the y-axis. And look what's happened up top. There's Virginia on the right-hand side, the Cipiens on the left, and bang in the middle is Phylacis. Furthermore, the Virginia populations include a discovery of that species as a fairly robust mallee just 400 metres away from the meal-up Phylacis. So pretty compelling genetic evidence there that Phylacis is in fact a very rare hybrid between Eucalyptus decipiens and Eucalyptus virginia. This photo just brings us back to buds and fruits if you're used to identifying your eucalypts that way. And on the right-hand side on the red book, you can see typical decipiens with its triangular buds, its white stamens and its small truncated fruit. Phylacis beside it. So notice that the buds are no longer diamond-shaped. They're a bit more rounded on the operculum. They're slightly larger too than decipiens buds, as are the flowers and the fruits. They're all a bit larger. And notice the valves in decipiens, the valves on the fruit just poke up top, above the rest of it. In Phylacis, they poke up a bit more, and the enlarged image to the lower mid photo shows how big they can be in Eucalyptus virginia. So you can see that they poke out a long way, and the buds of Virginia are almost orbicular, completely rounded on a long stalk as well in Eucalyptus virginia. The Denmark tree is shown there from Mount Lindsay, and the meal-up form of Eucalyptus virginia, this rather straggly white-trunked mallee, is shown there. So this is a case where modern techniques involving DNA sequencing have really nailed the correct, we think, interpretation of what this extremely rare plant is. Furthermore, there was no variation around the car park. So we know this is a clonal single individual. The size of it suggests, if you work on an outward rate of expansion for mallee eucalypts of about 2 centimetres a year, you're looking at several thousand, if not 10,000 years old. So it's probably one of our oldest living creatures in Western Australia, if not Australia. So that's species level stuff. The ridge is exciting because there are also rare habitats or communities. And one that I've paid particular attention to is granite flat rocks that are inland off the coast. You'd all be familiar with the granite running down the coastline itself, but finding granite outcrops inland is a harder task. And I just show a few of them in the map with labels for rocks, and the one illustrated is one that I dubbed Gracetown Road Rock. And it was, when that photo was taken in the early 1990s, a really impressive rock. You can see it has plenty of namas on it and a really big one on it as well. So these granite outcrops are renowned throughout WA as having their own endemics. And just one example from Augusta's Flat Rock. This is a very famous rock of lower elevation on Blackwood, the edge of the Blackwood Inlet on the west side. And you can see that this snakebush, Hemiandra split windy harbour, occurs on Augusta's Flat Rock, but it's most common heading down towards Walpole and Windy Harbour. And unlike a typical snakebush, which is a sprawling prostrate thing, this is a small upright shrub, still to be named. So it's a undescribed species, and that's typical of, if you take the whole flora of Western Australia, about 10% of the flora is still estimated to be unnamed by Western scientists. So lots of good fun to be had in tracking down these things and convincing younger botanists to become taxonomists and put names on. The excitement of the Gracetown rock is this tremendously big and interesting nama that occurred on it. And this slide shows a plant that, if you look at the inset map from Florabase, you'll see there's no dots at all on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge. However, below the map is a photo and a bit of material that I collected from my field notebook of a fern ally called Pileularia novae hollandii, and it's very clearly dominating on the floor of this very large nama that's about 30 metres across and gets up to 20 centimetres deep. On the left-hand photo, there's things like glossostigma mudworts, there's isoedes, and if you look carefully, you'll see the filamentous leaves of Pileularia there as well. Now, this nama, when I visited it in October 1991, was part of a housing subdivision that hadn't yet been surveyed, as far as I could tell. We just walked south off Gracetown Road and found this sitting on the top of a river valley, the Quarama Brook Valley. Subsequently, I visited it since 1991, and usual things happened. A road went in, it was clear, blocks had been surveyed, and it turned out that the rock ended up being separated into 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of the suburban blocks. So I haven't been back to it recently, but it's the only large nama I know of on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge, with this really unique plant on it as well. And furthermore, it's not only Pileularia, but I made a comprehensive collection in 1991 and did collect a herbarium voucher, as well as put a bit in my field notebook. And that voucher number is 8216, and it's now in the West Australian Herbarium. So you can see for this myriaphyllum, there is in fact a blue dot on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge. There's another view of the nama shown here. You can see the size of it. It's just extraordinary. Something you won't see anywhere else on the ridge. And there's this wonderful little annual myriaphyllum, limnophyllum, named by Tony Orchid in the 1970s, I think, or 1980s. You can see it's mostly north-south in distribution. The Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge sample is an outlier to the west. So it's a second aquatic that was really unusual. And then, in addition, there were at least half a dozen other aquatic nama species in the big nama on the Gracetown Road rock. So that's an extremely rare community and habitat. And my hope is that if people were of a right mind who now own parts of this nama, that they could have a decent go at restoring it to the former glory that was evident in 1991. Other rare plants include weeds, and in 1996, I was involved with a group of other people in a survey of a place called Big Rock, just near Dunsborough, north of Dunsborough, and we scoured it and collected every species we could find, and there was this intriguing little annual with opposite leaves and these little white fruity-like things with a slender style sticking out of them. I just didn't have a clue what it was. It was collected by one of my colleagues on that expedition, a German PhD student, and he showed it to Paul Wilson in the WA Herbarium. And Paul did a lot of homework and found that it was a species of Caryophyllaceae called Elisibrum verticillatum, which is a Mediterranean endemic. So that was the first record for the state of this weed. Bottom left is a photo. I've now been lucky enough to get into some of the granites in the Mediterranean, and the Spanish home of this species is shown there. Some magnificent granites with namas and the like, and lots of the weeds we have on our granites in Western Australia are native to those granites in Spain. So this was a new record for the state of a weed, and the blue dots in this case on the Flora-based map are all based on precise locations of collections made since October 1996. You can see it was either confined to Big Rock and it spread southwards, or in fact it already dispersed by means unknown to a wider area. Now, weediness is a feature that can also happen with our native flora. And just this year, I became aware of this situation. So here's the declared rare tea, Canidia lataridia, used to be Canidia macrophylla. Lataridia, completely inappropriate name because it's a granite endemic. It's not associated with laterite much at all. So some confusion must have happened in Mueller's mind over the soil type on which the type specimen came. As you can see, it's an Augusta Cape Leeuwin endemic. Walking around the suburb in which I now live, a good beach on Frenchman's Bay in King George Sound, just a month or two ago, I came across a substantial population of this growing along the edge of the road, including plants mixed up with common weeds like Pelargonium capitatum. I therefore infer that this is a garden escape that has felt quite comfortable in establishing itself in Albany, a long way to the southeast of its native range. And therefore, could be a classic example of the earliest stages of a native plant becoming a weed outside of its natural range. Another form of rarity is to do with fire. And there are just a few plants in our flora that seem to be obligate disturbance opportunists. Not necessarily or solely fire, but most common after fire. And this is a rare plant that I turned up just last year. You might recall there was a fire on Caves Road that escaped from a prescribed burn, if I recall correctly. And I got onto that burnt ground this year and just found beneath the xanthorrhoeas and the peppermints, the ground was carpeted with a little white-flowered annual, which is shown here, enlarged in a couple of photos. This is and remains one of the few examples of endemic families to the southwest Australian floristic region. It's Eremocynea pectinata, and its geographical distribution, you can see, ranges from the southern Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge right across to almost Chain Beach. It almost makes it that far. I've seen it at least a dozen places, and it likes its feet wet. It's often on granites, in fact. And I've monitored populations of it elsewhere and found that it's this little rosetted weed with verticillate leaves running up the flowering stems. Just that first year after a summer wildfire, and then you go back the next year, you won't find it. So it's obviously got very long-lived seed. And I can say that because Two People's Bay Nature Reserve had a lightning strike in 2015, 80-year-old vegetation in many places. There was no prior record of Miramosyne being seen on Two People's Bay Nature Reserve until that first year after the November 2015 wildfire. The next year, same deal. Granite rocks in particular, just carpeted with this little annual. So that's interesting in itself. It's one that very clearly is rare and being a disturbance opportunist, even though its seeds are underfoot, obviously, and very long lived. Now, this is a really bizarre species because it's sister to the Escaloniaceae and a couple of genera in Tasmania and the Nothofagus forests of the east coast in Australia, but mostly a series of genera in South America are nearest relatives. And it diverged from those sisters at least 70 million years ago. So it's an ancient relic species that's become an annual and a disturbance opportunist. So that's probably the most bizarre and unusual and exciting of the rare plants that you will see on the wonderful Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge. I'd just like to finish off with a little bit of discussion on our work with the Webb family. We're at UWA Albany just in the last year of 4 years on a project called Walking Together, and that project is focused on us going out on country with elders and their families and videotaping discussions, oral history discussions about matters ecological with families who wish to share such knowledge. The videotapes and the transcriptions we make from them are not our intellectual property. They belong and are retained by the Noongar people who provide it to us. And if, as has happened now with increasing frequency, there's completely unpublished, unrecorded stuff outside of Noongar oral history traditions that would benefit from publication, we routinely ask the elders would they agree to that happening and would they like to join us as co-authors on the paper that follows. So my team now, which comprises myself and Alison Lolfitz as a postdoc research associate, and 3 or 4 PhDs and a couple of master's students. One of the master's students is in this photo, the lady with the long blonde hair on the left, and the black t-shirt. That's Genevieve. And she's standing beside Zach Webb and Wayne Webb. And there are rangers called the Underlap Rangers here, and they have come up with Jen to be briefed by John Huseman in this case. I think it's Rachel Biggs, it might be as well in the photo there, about what the herbarium does. And Genevieve's project is on the emu plum, Podocarpus druinianus, looking at genetic variation in it. It's an incredibly important cultural plant to the Webb family and to other families that lived in the southern forests. Various questions are raised by the fact that it occurs in large populations and it's edible, not least of which is, did the Noongars move the fruits around? If they did, then you would expect a substantial genetic homogeneity across the range of the species. If they didn't, then you would expect the normal Southwest Australian genetic pattern of significant differences as you move from population to population. So the Webbs were here learning about Western science. Wayne and Zach were sharing with Genevieve and had done for 10 years or so their family's oral tradition about this important totemic plant. The Webbs are one of just 2 or 3 families we know of on the south coast who have continuous oral history. They escape stolen generation suppression. And if you gain the confidence of people like this and work with them in a long-term collaborative way and genuinely respect and listen to them and share your knowledge of Western science, then it's a very powerful learning experience. And it's clear that I just had a look at a videotape before I gave this talk in Margaret River, and a videotape of Wayne, and we must have walked 15 metres on the just off Caves Road, and had yarns about all these plants you can see in this composite mosaic, except for the big tree that Wayne is pointing to. That big tree became the subject of a master's project just finished. It's called Nama Borna. So Nama is the word for pool, usually rock pools on granite, as I've already talked about. But also there are trees, and in the southern forest, often marri trees. They can be karri or they can be red tingle. They can be York gum further out, and salmon gum when you get into salmon gum country. And they're characterised by having a nama at human height, with lots of lateral branches. And if you look carefully at the photo beside Wayne's left hand there, you'll see that the base of that upright trunk has been chiselled out with a stone axe to form a furrow to drain water into the pool. So these are tremendously important species. This one is particularly large and no longer holds water, but they're created by snipping out the leading shoot on a seedling and training it to have upright side branches, and then waiting 150 to 200 years to get to the size of the plant in the image there. This is incredibly long-term planning, and the water, and if it's in marri, is medicinal, but also ceremonial. And we've discovered as well from information coming from Leeuwin Naturaliste Albany that they often occur in linear arrangements through the forest. Those linear arrangements reflect song lines or travel paths. So we actually have a living example, a living tree that can help us reconstruct the precise pathways followed by noongars in certain places where water trees are abundant enough. So you can see tremendous diversity of examples of food sources, and the yellow Pattersonia on the right, the bracts that surround the fruiting inflorescences are used like a kazoo membrane to form a whistle-like structure. Wayne showed me, the first noongar to show me, that macrosomia was often woven into small carrying containers. Leucopogon verticillata, you can eat the seeds of. The bracken fern there, that's a good anti-insect bite thing to apply. Orchids were eaten, and Wayne's favourite is the Thelymitra, top left. So all sorts of wonderful things to be learnt just by spending time. Also, the macrosomia has edible resin on it. I had no idea of that until Wayne showed me just a couple of years ago. And even the very common trees. So I've talked about Borna in marri. So marri is also famous as being a source of kumar, which is possum. And jarrah trees, the bark of jarrah was used for constructing maya, little huts. It really is eye-opening to travel around with these families where there is continuous oral history, and even families with stolen generation, they have retained an extraordinary amount of information as well. The webs know get all sorts of signals about where to travel and what to do. For example, the parrots on the Leeuwin Naturaliste Ridge, when they fly near the coast, they signal times to fish for either herring, if it's purple crown lorikeets that are flying in to feed on the carry trees and the like, or salmon, if it's black cockatoos coming in to feed on marri and banksias. So I've been lucky enough to travel on what I call my kudjul bidawang. So kudjul is the Noongar word for number 2 or second, and bidawang, bead is a word for veins in your arm or leg or whatever, but also trails through the bush, and wang alludes to talking. So this is my second initiation journey into the bush of Western Australia. I'm revisiting granite rocks that I surveyed for Rare Flora in the 1980s and 1990s, and didn't have a clue that I was walking over extensive examples of Noongar presence on the granites. I was walking past edible plants. Even the photo here, that's a marri leaf, and you can see if you strip it away the upper and lower epidermis, then you've got this kazoo membrane on a young marri leaf. So you just put that in your mouth and blow away, and you can play it to any tune you like. Also, the coastline is just so important to Noongars, and there's marine biology writ large to be explored. And I guess a concluding thought is that if you read the ethnographic literature on Noongar traditional ecological knowledge, what was written down almost exclusively by male surveyors and explorers who were talking to male Noongars. The women and kids were kept away and did that by choice. Obviously, some pretty nasty stuff happened down on the south coast with sealers and whalers in the early days. Because of that, at least half the information, if not more, about traditional ecological knowledge has never been committed to paper, and therefore has escaped whitefellas from understanding any of it. Women are the primary teachers in Noongar culture. They bring up the kids and they teach them. They teach whitefellas the same sort of stuff. So we're treated initially as uninitiated males or females. So we get the simple public domain stories that are safe to share. If you want to get into the detail that biologists have a desire to do, then working with Noongar women in particular has the potential to reveal completely undescribed, undocumented knowledge on the land and in the sea. It's not entirely about women. So this is my last slide, and it's Zach Webb. Zach has been trained by his father in his family's oral tradition. He's a gifted communicator. He looks after ranger groups, the Underlup Ranger Group now, and he's training younger Noongars himself. And Wayne, sits back often. He's the quiet one, and Zach will tell you the family traditions. And he's just a tremendous font of knowledge. When I presented this talk in Margaret River, at this stage we broke into a yarning session, Zach and I, and had 20 minutes. And it was just jaw-dropping stuff that he was coming out with, demonstrating the tremendous knowledge that the family has, not only about the things, which the plants and animals and their Noongar names, but their interactions and what country they occur on and how you manage that country in a sustainable way. So I'll leave it at that, and very happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Steve. That was incredible. That's that is just crazy to think that you've done all of these things, and especially all of the Indigenous knowledge that's still around. Thankfully, it's not, all been lost through the history, and that, you've been able to learn it and then share with everyone else as well. That's it's fantastic. Please send any questions through. There's no better time to do it. We've got a very, very experienced and well-versed person who's ready to answer to the best of their ability.
So I see here, Katie, that there's AM, is it, has come in with just saying, after reading Renee Pettit-Ship's Denmark article, she's looked for and discovered a younger Bornanama, or Coppiced Mary, last week. I noticed the smooth edges, frequently used by fauna for a drink. Height of about 1.5 metres on the Collie River Valley. If you're willing to share that sort of information, I'd really appreciate an email, with photos or location details. But the lady who did the master's thesis, Anna Arshenko, may continue onto a PhD. We're a little uncertain about that. If she doesn't, we're sure we'll get other students who'll be interested in following up on this. And just the fact that it's turned up in Collie, there is one record of Bornanama, and that's by James Drummond, when he was on his first trip, I think, out to Tujay to select land, and he commented on a marri tree that had a pool that he called Kepborna from memory. So that's the only record I've found. Other than, Daisy Bates recorded Lynette Knapp's great grandmother, a lady called Jack Bam, recorded a vocabulary of hers, 40 pages, and right at the end of it, there's a little comment about they used, where do they get their water from, was the question, and she said, from the bowl of marri trees. So that we have those two little written snippets in the historical literature. But for Anna's project, we had 71 Nama Borna in the Denmark to Albany to Stirling Range area documented. It's very clear we need lots of people looking out for these. As soon as we know where they are, we can pass on to DBCA the location of them, and hopefully they might be able to afford them some protection from prescribed burning.
Of course, yeah. Jackie has asked, does Zach and his family do educational tours?
They sure do. You've just got to be on the grapevine. I suggest you get in touch, Jackie, with the Underlup Association. That's their corporation, if you like, and they have a lady who's at least a part-time secretary for that association, and ask that same question of her. How can you tie in? It's a life-changing experience, I think.
I can imagine, yeah. Warwick has asked, is Margaret River on the ridge? I heard a forester once described the sunk lands as shit country, so it seems that the ridge is quite a feature.
The ridge is. It's underlain by these granites, which share a lot of similarity to granites in Tibet. So it goes right back that far. The Donnybrook Sunklands, as the name used to be when I was a young fellow surveying rare flora, the intervening country that runs into the Darling Scarp on the east side, and they were called Sunklands, which was a bit of a derogatory term. And I remember in my day, people were saying the country was so bad that they may as well plant it up with pines, get something useful out of it. Fortunately, not all the country is treated that way, and as we've discovered since the Yarragadee formation, the big aquifer is underneath the Sunklands, and they're full of plants along the Witcher escarpment on the north side, Scott River Plain on the south side, and even in the forested areas in between, which have many rare species in it. So we're still discovering lots of things there.
Fantastic. Zahara has asked, they've said, I'm about to begin a PhD researching fig trees in the Pilbara. How would you recommend I begin to gain an understanding of the traditional meaning and uses of these trees?
It took me 5 years living in Albany to get to know the local Noongar population, and then to get to know who might be interested in working with us, and then get to know who had continuous oral history and who didn't. So it's not fast science. I haven't had direct experience in the Pilbara. I've only got up as far as the Ashburton and the Murchison. But basically, it's really important to show respect to elders up front, and to elders who were born on the country that you're interested in. It's disrespectful for other Noongars to talk to you if they're not born in that country first of all, and if they're younger people, without first getting the permission of the elders. So finding out who the elders are, that's getting easier. Having a cup of tea with them, getting to know them as individuals, asking if there's anything you can do to help them, rather than going and say, I'm doing a PhD, what can you tell me about X or Y? I see Stephen Lane Leeuwin's in the audience. He could advise us on that too, because he's Noongar himself, and a very prominent Noongar these days. So I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that, Stephen.
Well, Stephen did say to build your relationship with elders and knowledge holders, take time to find out who has the cultural authority to speak for country. So
yep.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so Richard has asked, said this is unrelated to this evening's presentation, but could you explain why when you were at Kings Park, the Mediterranean collection was collected by many years was destroyed?
It wasn't entirely destroyed. We left one garden of the Mediterranean collection, but the policy was adopted by the board of the day that Kings Park should focus on celebrating the native flora. And it was very clear that garden escapes from the Mediterranean garden were becoming weeds. So what we did was reduce the Mediterranean gardens from 5 down to 1, and retain a selection of plants that we could manage in terms of weediness. So that's why, and it's particularly important in places like southwestern Australia, in which the older parts of the landscapes in particular are incredibly vulnerable to weed encroachment, as I hope I've demonstrated with the Caladenia. Even the native plants become weedy if our penchant for moving things around as Western culture applies. So that was the policy that was developed when I started there.
All right, thank you for that. Well, okay, I think that we will probably wrap it up unless anyone has, we've got one more. As it's 8:45, we'll probably do one more question and then we can wrap it up because it's getting a bit late. So Simon's asked, could you please comment on the change in soil type along Leeuwin Ridge above Albany Cliffs from the coastal heath on the seaward side to the Karri Forest inland, as there is a very abrupt change in vegetation type? It's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I don't know the Albany Cliffs per se, but I am aware of the rapid transition you're talking about. It relates, I believe, to how close the bedrock is to the soil surface. So right on the coast, you've got granite exposed, and very stunted coastal vegetation sitting on top of the granite when soil pockets allow. And then you get into peppermint country as you go upslope, and you get a bit of limestone as well. I think there's often a transition or an interchangeability between the granite and the limestone. And the soil deepens very rapidly as you go up onto the ridge until you get to the top, and you might get a bit more Cronkin-like vegetation go over the ridge, and you're in Carry. So it's all about where is the granite in relation to the soil surface that will determine the height and often the composition of the flora.
Perfect. Thanks for that question, Simon. I think if there's anyone else that has any more questions, I might just quickly ask one as well. Maybe somewhat of a tricky question, but if you could, not because of the detail, but if you could somewhat summarise your experience over all of this time on the Leeuwin Ridge, could you pick maybe one highlight of what is the most memorable or the best part of all of that, the 50 years?
I mean, it's like many places elsewhere in southwestern Australia, just a rapid turnover in species across very short distances, a bit like Simon's question. But particularly when you get into the higher, slightly elevated parts of the landscape, so the granite, where the granite's exposed in the higher points, they become like islands. And if you're on one granite outcrop and there's another one a kilometre away, in the early days, I used to assume, well, they'll have similar flora, but you find there's turnover in species even over distances as short as half a K. So that means every granite rock is a surprise waiting for you. When you think of what it's like in the Northern Hemisphere, I spent 6 years living in London, and the stuff you see in England, you'll see on the continent. In Europe, slightly more species in Europe, but virtually the same tree species going right across through to Eastern Europe and into Russia over thousands of kilometres. Here, and you can travel just 1 kilometre and you'll see as greater differences than a person working through the forest from the UK to Russia. So that's pretty special. That's remarkable. And the Wardandi are remarkable in developing a way of living that kept such diversity for us for the best part of 60,000 years. We have a lot to learn, I think, about how to care for it. I am concerned that if development continues at the pace it's continuing, a bit like the Big Nama rock on south of Gracetown Road, some really special places are going to go underway before we even know what's on them. So really important that people are out there documenting the flora. We can use computer techniques like iNaturalist these days. Even if you don't have to know the species names or anything, you can still make a positive contribution by uploading images with known geographical locations.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a very good point to take, is that we definitely have a lot to learn from our Indigenous peoples of the land that we are inhabiting. But yes, I think we can all agree that development continuing needs to stop. We need to listen to the people that know the land the best, that's for sure.
Yeah, and celebrate what Western scientists have found too. I think it's a two-way exchange that is really going to deliver to us, I think, new ways of caring for stuff that might actually see it persist for as long as the Wardandi people have looked after it.
Yeah, of course. Make sure we have that collaboration. Okay, well, I think that we will wrap it up for the night. Thank you so much, Steve, for coming on. I think that was just a fantastic presentation, and yeah, I think we could all probably listen to you for another 10 hours straight, and we would be happy to keep going. But thank you so much. That was really fantastic. And thank you to everyone else that has joined us tonight. I'm sorry about the technical delays at the start, but thanks for bearing with us. No, we really appreciate everyone's ongoing support for our webinars. So we hope to see you at our next one, which may be in the new year or maybe one mid-December. We're not sure yet, but you'll definitely hear from us either way. So thanks again, Steve. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. See ya.